Okay, so now I think that's working. Okay, sorry for the, oh, no, still nothing projecting. Okay, sorry for the delay getting started. Some students couldn't make it today, so I'm going to be trying to record today's lecture, so that's why I have this funky headset on. How to find papers, hey. Other people have appreciated having the video, so I'm going to try and record both the screen and the audio, and then I'll upload the video. So I left some things in my office. We'll eventually have to take a break as I do the exercises. But today I want to talk about writing. And I'm going to talk about writing probably in a way you've not seen it before, except for maybe Swati. So first of all, if you're looking for a good book on how to write, and these slides, by the way, are up on Blackboard, so you don't have to copy these things down. This book by Joshua Schummel is a really good book on writing science. He also has a couple of videos. This is one of them. I know he's got 2 or 3 others. I couldn't find the other ones today when I went looking for them. But so he's actually not a computer scientist. He's a polar scientist, I think, or maybe a geology guy. But he really has a good set of instructions on how to write. I actually think it's probably better for you in some sense to not have the topic be your area, because it's easier to be dispassionate and separate out his advice, because it's not about everything you know that's going on. So it's a pretty good book. There's actually lots of other books. I've got a couple other links in here as well. But this one is really good because it's far more about 2 elements. The storytelling element that I'm going to spend more time on today. Actually, I go much deeper into storytelling than he does. But he also has lots of examples of, here's a good way of saying something, and here's a bad way of saying exactly the same thing. So some people like to learn more from examples, and so you can go through that, and that will actually help. So I'm not going to cover everything that was in his book. I'm going to cover a bunch of different things. But first, I want to start off with a comment that surprises many students. But you are now a professional writer. Okay? You are being paid, and you are writing. That makes you a professional writer. In fact, as a researcher, you get paid to produce written reports, or to produce papers, or books, or all of the above. That makes you as part of it being a professional researcher, you're a professional writer. And you should treat it that way. This is not just something you do after you did the science. Writing is part of science, and that's something that many students seem to want to get, put off on the side, right? You're all about the science. Well, if you're all about the science, it's not science until other people understand it. Before then, it's your own ideas. Okay? So a scientific paper is a paper written and published that report on the results of original research. It's not going to do anything if no one else knows about it. Now, it's true, in today's world, you don't always have to write about your research. You could do videos about your research. You could do other things, but it has to be communicated. And so, in fact, a lot of what we're going to talk about today is not just how to write. It's how to communicate your science at a broader level. Okay? If you really want to have a good scientific paper, it must be the first publication of original research results. That's what a lot of people say, but you'll often find that first you publish it in a conference, and then the same research idea shows up in a journal. Well, then is the second one not scientific? Well, no. Often what happens is the conference has the initial idea, but doesn't have as deep an experiment, doesn't have as deep a description. So the journal version of the same paper has more thorough experiments, better presentation, often has a better comparison to the rest of the state of the art, because when they went and gave their conference paper, they got feedback, and they'd use that to refine it and make a better paper. So that statement that it must be, well, one of them should be the first. But if you've already published it, you can often do a second paper. On the other hand, if you publish it, I can't do a second paper and make any meaningful claims. So the publishing field understands that difference. Okay. It is, in many fields, a forum where peers of the authors can repeat the experiments and test the conclusions. And that's the ideal publication. A publication where after I get done reading it, I can re-implement everything would be great. I would say of the papers I've read this year, there are 2 out of a couple hundred that I could implement from what's in the paper. And that's because both of those were PhD theses. In an 8-page paper, you're not going to describe it in enough detail enough to implement all of computer science stuff. So, in fact, I would also know that a whole bunch of the papers I read today, I don't have to re-implement everything. Good science today is often open, and you might actually publish your code. here's my paper, here's a link to the GitHub repository where you can get my code, then you can go replicate my experiments without redoing everything. And that's a much stronger and faster way to make sure that you have the replicability. But I've been involved in reviews where the fact that the work could not be replicated is sufficient reason often to reject the paper. Okay, so even if it's not every detail is there should be close to enough detail that even if you don't give out your code, people can understand and replicate that work. Otherwise, it's not yet, you're not telling them everything. Okay, and it should be in a journal, a source document, readily available in the scientific community. So in some of these slides, right, in every other field of science, journals are probably the only thing that matter for publication. We're odd as computer science, but I want to keep making that juxtaposition because if you go join a different department, you might see something in a different way. So other source documents for us, conference papers rarely meet this because they're often 6 or 8 pages. Journal papers might be 14, so you get a lot more space in between them. That's actually one of the reasons to turn them into journal papers. Your thesis documents will obviously be public, and that'll be a lot better. But what is our goal? Why do we have this accepted publication? Well, one is to be able to assess the observations, okay, to repeat experiments. So the reason you're publishing isn't just to say, here's my idea. You actually want to give out that idea at a level of detail so that the other researchers can validate your idea. How many of you have ever tried to implement what you saw described some on a web page or in a paper? How many of you were successful from that alone? Depends on how small the idea was, how good it is. Okay, how many of you have been unable to replicate something you've read in a paper or seen someplace else? Okay, why do you think you couldn't replicate it? Anyone? Joe?
In my case, I know exactly why I couldn't. It's because they made a lot of claims, but they didn't publish their methodology in sufficient detail.
Okay, so one
had to make a lot of guesses.
Right, and so you have to make lots of guesses, and if you make some of those guesses wrong, in fact, if you make just one of those guesses wrong, experiment might work. Okay, anybody else have a different reason they couldn't replicate? Okay, well, I mean, that's really the same thing. So there's a bunch of implicit and explicit limitations. Anyone else have any other reasons they couldn't? Tom? Right, so the validity problem isn't, so it's actually related in the same way. There's implicit assumptions, but now they're implicit in, like, the environment, where they ran it. So what that really means is if, in fact, those kinds of assumptions, as opposed to ones that they could tell you they just didn't bother, if the experiment can't be replicated because it's a function of where you did it, if the experiment can only be run at the North Pole, you have a much more limited experiment. It might be repeatable if you do it at the North Pole, but anywhere where you actually have the Earth spinning around enough, it fails, then it's not a very interesting experiment. So it's very limited. So those implicit things are reasons. Anyone else have any other reasons they've seen? So we won't name names, but I've actually tried to replicate people's experiments only to find out that they could not be replicated. And when I talked to we couldn't. When I talked to the advisor of the person, he said, yeah, I don't believe those results either. It's like somewhere along the way, something happened, and the advisor lost trust that these results really happened. And those could be things as simple as, you know, you were supposed to run on this big file of data, but somehow the file got truncated, and you didn't pay attention, so you get really phenomenal results. And as I think I reported last class in one of my own papers, somewhere in the code, because I was coding it, made a mistake, and I swapped I and J in one function. And I got results that made my algorithm look really, really good. And in fact, it looked so good that I didn't believe the results. So I sent it off to other people. It's like, here's the paper, here's the code. Did I do something wrong? And I had 2 different people look through the code. None of them could find the error I made because there's like I and J and I, and it's like virtually impossible. And eventually, you know, so the paper got published. People eventually believed that I came up with a story, which I'll talk about later. If you have unbelievable results and a story that doesn't make sense, you cannot publish your paper. If you have wrong results that are unbelievably good and you come up with a good story, you can still publish them only to find out later they're wrong. You don't always want to fit the story to make sense. You really want to have that story up front. The scientific method of hypothesis and then test is really the right way to go about generating your story. But so the reason we want to repeat experiments is because there might actually be problems in the experiment, not necessarily intentional, They just had a small error, and it propagates into terrible things. Can you ask for the code? Can you? You can always ask. Will they give it to you? Some will, some won't. Depends. Oh, absolutely, they have the right to say no. They have the right to say, we're a commercial entity, we're not even going to give you the data. But as an editor for a journal, as a reviewer for a conference, we also have the right to say, well, if this worked, if you're not releasing the code, you're not releasing the data, and we can't reproduce your results, then it's not science, it's marketing. You can publish in whatever marketing venue you want, but we're going to reject your paper. We actually had in my own community a very significant discussion this year because of that, where eventually they overturned me as the person who recommended the paper be rejected, and it had to go up through the hierarchy of other people. And in the end, the company won out. And I think I mentioned this last class, right? They eventually agreed to do what I said. If they had done this, the paper could be published, but that's not what's in this paper, so I can't accept it. They published it on one more data set that was public, so that somebody could at least try and compete with them on some other data set. But no, they don't have to release their data, but you don't have to accept their paper. If it's published in a place and you can't get the code, then it's actually not uncommon when you're writing in your paper that I could not compare against them because they didn't release their data, they didn't release their code, so we're going to compare against this. So it sometimes means you don't get to compare against the absolute state of the art. Despite that being the goal, you should always be trying to compare against the state of the art. If the state of the art won't give you access to it and you can't re-implement it, that's okay. Another technique along the same way, we've deviated far from my slide, sorry, but another good technique is you implement as best you can, and then you send them and say, we couldn't reproduce your results, this is the best we can get, and this is what we're going to publish. You can either give us the code or give us some way of debugging why you say it's 90% and we're getting 60%, because otherwise we're just going to get it published. And that makes them look bad. If that discrepancy comes up, non-replicable results in science are, in every other field of science, actually publishable. And even in computer science, they're sometimes publishable. But now you have a little bit of, he said, she said, they say it works, you say it doesn't. So sometimes you have to get a third group to try and implement, see where it goes. But I mean, this is like where we were with cold fusion, right? It doesn't exist, but people couldn't replicate the experiments. And those who did found out the experiments had flaws in their design. Yes?
So our company, we wound up actually funding CU Boulder to do some research for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess we went into an agreement with them where they could actually do all the research, publish all the papers, but we put a restriction in saying they can't publish the source code.
Okay.
So, I mean, I guess that's the case where
Well, oh yeah, it happens frequently where they cannot release the source code. But if they've done good science, they should have released enough data and a good enough description that maybe somebody could replicate the experiments. Or, and this is like, for example, for a number of things I did at my own company where we have like patented algorithms and whatever, we released, here's the inputs, here's the outputs, you can compare against us by using this protocol. You may not be able to implement our algorithm, but you can always compare against us because we did all of the data that you can then analyze and do the comparison. Replicating our algorithm means you have to read our papers and try and replicate them because we did not give out the source code. So not giving out the source code is a very, very, very common thing. I'm not saying it's there. But what I'm saying is we have actually had somebody try and replicate our results. That led to this, actually as a group I was working with, we were trying to replicate our own results and failed. We started from scratch with a new implementation and couldn't make it happen, and that's how we found where the bug was. But other times you'll get that somebody will go to them and then they'll collaborate. So this is something we did with another group where we could not replicate the results. They can't give us their code, but we can work together and they can run, because we want to do a comparison on their data, but their data doesn't solve our problem. So then you get them to run it again with their code but our data and see where they are. So there's a balance in the middle. There are people far more radical than I am. I know some people in my community where it's like, if the code's not public, we shouldn't accept the papers. And it is a common thing within our community that when the paper's submitted, it should say if it's going to be open source code and whatever, and if two papers are close, they go for the open source paper every time because it's easier for science to build on that. So anyhow, so the other reason to publish, to evaluate the intellectual process, and this can be true even if you can't repeat the experiments. This is the other value of a paper. the paper may not be about experiments. The paper may be about a theory and an idea, and that alone intellectually is stimulating enough that it doesn't matter that I can't see your code, because I don't actually want your code. I want to go take that idea and use it on my problem. Your code is useful for your problem. I want your idea and my problem, and then it becomes still a good thing to publish. In my view, it absolutely must have an impact. It's not actually meaningful to have a paper that doesn't get cited. And I didn't actually get to update all my slides. I was going to put some slides in here on some recent numbers from Nature Neuroscience. They did a study. Something like 80% of all published papers in the last 5 years have yet to be cited. Okay. And to me, that's a disaster. Right? And the part is about the open source publishing and all these new journals, and there's a ton of journals. Papers that are not published are worse than not having published a paper. If you publish too many papers that no one cites, you're proving to the world that your ideas have no value because no one is citing them. You know, so this is the difference between, right, you know, the difference, you know, putting your foot in your mouth so that you don't say something stupid is sometimes better than saying something and proving that you're a fool. Publishing a paper that no one cites. If you do it once, you're taking risk. You got to take risks. So, but if you publish everything, but if 80% of the papers published in the last 5 years are not cited, that means most of them were a waste of money and resources, and we should be a little more focused on what's going on. On the other hand, when we talk about what to publish, I will tell you that you should really, unless you're sure it's bad, don't publish it. You should try and publish it, but publish it in a place that's going to actually push you, give you meaningful feedback. If you send it to a journal that accepts everything, and there are journals that have accepted machine-generated papers that were garbage. And so if you've not heard about this, you just Google machine-generated papers in conferences and journals. So there's a bunch of tools that you just put in a bunch of keywords, and they will generate a paper for you. And if you read them as a human, you're like, what the is going on here? But they get accepted by these journals and conferences. So in fact, they're not good enough to fool humans, but they're good enough to fool lots of journals. What does that say about the reviewing process? Yeah. Somebody actually has to look at them? Oh, that's a little tougher. So again, another question which we talked a little bit about 2 classes ago is this idea of open access. It should be available to the scientific community without restrictions. Now, that without restrictions is a funny phrase because having to pay is not a restriction. In my view, in some people's view, even have to pay is a restriction. I'm a big proponent of open source and open publications, but if they have to have a subscription to a journal to get it, that might be a reasonable thing if enough people have that subscription. And it should be available for regular screening by one or more of the major recognized secondary services. This, to me, is actually critical. Whether it has to be available, if lots of people have to be able to get it, it should be in libraries. Libraries should subscribe. If it's a for-profit publisher and only 10 people in the world can get it, how much impact can you have? That's why I put this up higher. This is the most important thing, is if it's having an impact, even if people have to pay to download the paper, $25, that might still be a model to get it done. But it also wants to be something that's indexed, so things like indexed by Google, indexed by ISI and SCI, all these indexing things. Because, again, people want to be able to find it when they search for it. So those, to me, are all important parts of a scientific paper, and then there's just the question of how repeatable, how available is it, and open source makes both of those a whole lot better. So the next thing I wanted to mention, coming back to the broad scope, is if you look at what does it mean to be an academic, and what do you spend your time on? This is from a survey of top academic institutions, so these are research institutions, not quite a teaching school like UCCS. Our balance is a little bit different. In these schools, the teaching load is generally like 1-on-1, so they teach one course a semester. Here we teach double that, or more. But you'll see that where do they spend their time? Half of it is spent working on papers. Their focus is on good papers. Networking, talking, community service, grants is probably the second biggest chunk, and then teaching and mentoring. Okay, so when I talked about you being a professional writer at a top-tier school, not only a professional writer, it's the primary component of your job. Now, if you want to get to those places, you have to treat it as though that is going to be the primary part of your job, and you're going to be doing a lot of it. Does anyone notice anything missing in this drawing, by the way? I found this one interesting when I read it. I never followed up to answer this question, but what do you think is a problem with this drawing of how academics spent their time?
Professional development, which you could say your
Yeah. There could be a little chunks of that and everything else, but I think there's actually something more fundamental missing on this drawing. Yeah, so where's the research, right? Is research in the good papers? Is it in the grant? So it's got to be somewhere between the two of these. But so it's not quite all writing, but the research is really, it's not about doing the research. Why do I do the research? I do the research to support writing good papers. So you can just lump that into the writing because it is a big chunk of the writing. Right? I'm doing this so that I can write. And the reason that becomes interesting is if I turn it around and look at it in a different way, what I want to write drives how I do my research and what I do in my research. So one of the questions that you have to face is, when do you start writing your paper? And you'll find lots of different advice online, and a bunch of the articles I've looked at say you should start writing as soon as the experiments are done. And I think that's completely backwards. You should know what you're going to write and probably have started writing before you start the experiments. Why do you think I view it that way? Why should you write before you do the experiments? Joe?
Because you're trying to support whatever you're coming up with the experiment. You're not just doing shots in the dark with your experiment.
Right. Right. So the goal is not to run an experiment and hope you find something interesting. The scientific method, which you should be trying to apply, is you have a hypothesis, and you should be designing an experiment to test that hypothesis. It actually turns out to be very useful to write down, here's what I'm doing, because you'll find lots of imprecision in your thought process. In fact, there's a nice quote, which I forgot to find and put in here, but writing is a tool that helps us understand how badly we think. Because once you put it down and look at it, you say, really? That's what I was thinking? No, that's wrong. You got to fix it up. So before you run your big experiment, you should be writing some of, here's our objectives, here's our assumptions, here's how we're going to test those assumptions, and then you can spend a little bit of time sharing that with other people and communicating it, and it is better to have it written communication. So you're going to write that first part of your paper before you run your experiment so that you're running the right experiment. Otherwise, you can't get good feedback and criticism from other people. Many of the people view it the other way around, and it is true. You will rewrite that entire experimental description after you've done the experiment, because you don't want to say, here's what I was going to do. Along the way, you tweak some stuff and do things differently, and then publish, here's what I said I was going to do, but I did something different. That's how you get inconsistencies between your data and your description. Joe?
I have a question. So when you say you need to write it out, you don't need to write it out formally like you would for the paper, right? You just need to write out what you're doing. I mean, I guess that's what I'm asking. Do you need to do it formally, or do you just need to write it out?
So what does formally mean to you?
Meaning really good grammar, fix all your spelling, make sure it's all formatted right. Like you would do for a paper.
Oh, I would do that for a paper? Okay. So no, I would not worry about. Well, I would worry about. So grammar has two parts, right? How is it organized and what is it saying is still very important, because you have to communicate that correctly to whoever you're going to get to review your experimental design and process. So if it's not good enough that they understand you, then the grammar's a problem. But as soon as it's understandably precise, then spelling is always optional, at least in a draft. And this is definitely an early draft.
That's what I was asking.
Okay.
Is draft form okay, or does it need
draft form is okay until you hit the submit button. The day before we'll actually do an exercise in today's class. We'll look at something 24 hours before we submit it in the final version. And even 24 hours is a lot of time. Hold on. So top down and bottom up in terms of writing. So in terms of experiments, whether you do your experiments top down or bottom up depends on what your experiments need to show. So sometimes you can only do them bottom up, sometimes you can only do them top down, depending on your experimental processes. What I'm saying here is, whichever of those you're going to do, you should be writing a description of your hypotheses in your experiment before you begin doing the experiments. And that's so writing that part of your paper, because that is a part of the paper. Here's our methodology. Here's our assumptions. All of that stuff you want to start writing. And we'll see as we go later through this that my process for writing is neither top down or bottom up. It's like random scatter, and then put stuff together. And so I don't quite follow either methodology. because neither methodology always produces the right results. Sometimes you do it top-down, sometimes you do it bottom-up. The experiment might start with a single piece, and as you're doing that, you might recognize, oh, hold it, I didn't address this, I didn't address that. So it goes laterally, which is neither top-down or bottom-up. You need to go where the science takes you, not where you had your preconceived direction. So the last thing, or not the last thing, but an important thing in terms of the publication, yes, you will need to publish to get out of here, but in the long term, whatever you publish is your legacy. And maybe you don't care about your legacy, but if you do, remember that your papers actually will outlive you. But even before they outlive you, 10 years from now, what you say in a paper will be held against you. They will remember what you wrote. But they will remember they may or may not remember if you had grammar errors. I'm sure there are people who do. But they will mostly remember if your paper does good science. Okay? Whether or not your paper transforms your field, that'd be great. But if you keep doing good science, think of it as base hits. As long as you're getting those hits, you'll keep going. But you do want to put some effort in it. And there'll be a time when you do want to look at a paper and say, yeah, this just isn't ready. My recommendation on that will come back again later. It's a question of ready for what? Right? It might not be ready for science or nature, but it might be ready for something else and you want to move forward with it. But it's important when you're looking at your work to look at it from a distance. In fact, a particular distance in my recommendation, look at it as though you were the reviewer. You actually have two audiences, okay, or three. You have one audience, which is the people in your field at the conference or reading the journal that are going to read the paper, okay? But that isn't your first audience. Why isn't that your first audience? If it doesn't get accepted, they don't get to see it. So your first audience is the reviewer and the editor, okay, which you can sort of lump a bit together, but we'll actually talk a little bit about the difference between them in a second. Who will your third audience be? Who else might read this paper? Well, yeah, in this case, it might be your committee. But there might be somebody who's reading this paper that isn't in the field. Okay, so eventually you have a different audience. And so, in fact, when you're doing this, you might actually write the same paper twice because one of them is intended for experts in your field. You're writing for this narrow little conference. And then you might want to write the same thing as a abstract that's going to a broad conference that's interdisciplinary, or maybe you're trying to write it to get an article in the New York Times or in some other tech magazine to get interest in your technology. That's a very, very different audience. Okay, both of them have editors and reviewers, but they're sort of two different audiences: pure science and popular press or the rest of the world. You need to learn to write to all three of those. Okay, or four if you view it as two different reviewers. But when you're writing the same paper at the same time for at least two audiences always: editor and science, editor and popular, and very often you're actually writing for all three. The review committee that you would like to think of as having the experts who understand your field, you'll be disproportionately unhappy to find out, you'll be unhappy to find out that a disproportionate number of your reviewers are not experts in your field. They're experts in the broader field, but your sub-area of a sub-area of a field, they may have never read that stuff before. If you're lucky, with three reviewers, one of them really knows what you're talking about. Two of them have some general idea. So you're actually writing for that split audience always of somebody who's a generally good scientist in my field in computer vision might not know anything about biometrics or extreme value theory or whatever I'm writing about. So I have to teach them. And that's actually a big difference between showing somebody who knows a deep amount, here's a nice little insight, and teaching somebody who knows nothing. That's two very different styles you have to work for. But first and foremost, you got to write your paper to that reviewer. The problem is those reviewers are different. So it's not a reviewer model. From a high level, you have to think of different reviewers. Who could be the reviewer? What is their knowledge? How are they going to do this? Because they're not going to see it from the same methodology. Now, there's a different reason to look at those reviewers and the different audiences differently. What do you think is in the mind of a reviewer when they're reviewing? What is their goal? get through the paper. Get my reviews done. If I'm doing a conference, I have, for many conferences, I'll have 8, sometimes 13 papers to get reviewed. Okay? And I'm literally doing, like, I'm going to recommend some of these and not others. So there's another thing that's happening. It's not just to get through this paper. I'm going to get through all of them and compare. And I'm going to choose the best out of the group that I'm doing. Journals are a little bit different. I get one journal paper at a time. And I have, a month to review it. I have a lot more time to go through the journal paper. But even then, as an editor, I can tell you that I have received in the last 40 papers I've handled for this journal, I think. I received 2 reviews before we sent out a reminder. Each paper of those 40 gets 3 reviews. Well, should get 3, so I'm only get 2 because I can't get people to turn them in. So inevitably, people are under a little bit of time pressure when they're doing that review. They've got a reminder. They're trying to get stuff done. So are they really interested in what you're saying? Not really. They're interested in doing the review. So for them, you're writing to make their job as a reviewer easy. Now, what about the scientists reading your paper? What is their objective? Science? Get something out of it? So how many of you tried to get something out of those papers you browsed? Okay? How many of you got something out of all the papers you browsed? Not the ones you scanned, the ones you browsed. You got something out of it, okay? Many people are just trying to find something interesting, so they're not trying to get everything out of your paper. They have their own problem, not your problem. Your problem is not their problem. And most of them aren't really interested in science overall. They're interested in whatever the science they're trying to solve. So the real point of your paper is not how you solved your problem. It's how you can help them solve their problem. Now, to convince them that they can solve their problem, you might have to solve yours. But it's often a much broader thing. So it's not, they don't have the same motivation as you do. Okay? It's also important to understand that the best scientists get rejected and or have to make major revisions. If you don't have a tough skin, you're going to have to get tougher. Just to put some of those in statistics, Science, which is one of the most selective journals in science overall, has a 75% reject rate before anyone reads the paper. Okay, that is pretty much the browse. The editors of Science browse all the papers that are submitted, scan the papers maybe, and they reject most of them at that stage. No one has really gone through the paper. No reviewer goes through it. In my journal, of the 40 papers I've handled, 3 were rejected without ever getting reviews. Because I get to decide, this paper is just so bad, I am not going to waste my reviewer's time. And that's it. It's done. And there's no recourse. They can't appeal. They have to go find some other journal. Okay. So in mine, 3 out of 40, that's not much. 75%. Okay. Now, the good thing is some of those rejections are also really quick. The 3 of those got their answers within a month. I got the paper. If I get around to handling it, they get their answers right away. You might spend 2 years and then be in this category, which is rejected after an in-depth review. Now, 2 years is very long, but a year is not uncommon. Okay, and then they have 7% of their papers published. Now, that sounds really rough, but in the top conferences in computer science, we often have what are called posters and then orals. In my field, 5% are orals. So 5% of the papers get accepted for oral presentation. 20% get accepted for posters, and then the other 75% get rejected after some level of review, whether it's in-depth or before in-depth, depends on what the reviewers did. But you're just going to have to get used to that. Really good papers will be rejected. My field also has, and many fields actually have similar things, awards for papers that have stood the test of time. So papers that are more than 10 years old, and some of these have like 5,000, 10,000, or as in the year I gave out the award, 15,000 citations to this paper, it was not accepted as oral. In fact, the paper was rejected the first 2 times it was submitted, and then finally got accepted, and now it's got 15,000 citations. It doesn't mean it wasn't good work. Sometimes it's the way the work was presented, because the idea didn't really fundamentally change across those. So your job when you're writing is to get through the gauntlet process of what that is. It's not just about your science. So Gittimer is an author that I happen to like. So here's his list of 5.5 things he likes, odd number lists, to improve your writing. So the first thing is sit down and write something. If you haven't been writing a paper, you should. You should start writing one now. Even if you never publish it, it's good practice to write the paper. Capture your ideas and thoughts the second they occur. For this reason, we're actually going to do an exercise in just a little bit that will help you become better at that, which Joseph will have an advantage over all the rest of us because he actually knows how to type with his eyes closed. The rest of us will struggle writing or typing without it. I actually like to get you to go beyond your words and think about your ideas. And it's easier for me. These are techniques that I learned because of dyslexia. It was more important. But many people don't know what to write, and they're staring at their writing. So I want you to not look at that. We'll go to that in just a couple minutes. But write it as you would say it. So this is for many people. And for those of you who are English is not your native language, you can do your first draft in another language, right? Many of my students for whom English was not their first language, they struggled not with English, but with how to communicate in any language. Okay? If you can't communicate, it doesn't matter what the language is. Once you understand the flow of ideas, you can figure out how to translate them to English and get some help and grammar. All that stuff can be fixed if you know how to do the story, which is actually what we're going to spend more time on today. And after you're done, you're going to then edit to make sure your thoughts are simple, easy to understand, and complete. In the middle of writing an 8-page paper for me is probably 15 or 20 pages. Okay? Because there's a lot of ideas out there, most of which have no business being in a paper, but they work their way into the writing, and then you just keep throwing stuff away. Okay, so we'll actually go a little bit and go through some examples of that. Edit early and often. I would recommend that you're going to spend 70% of your time editing your paper, not writing it. Writing the paper is not hard. It's editing that's hard. Writing is just putting things down, and you have to go through that. You're writing for the reader and for yourself, so you have your own goals. They have their goals, and you have to find something that simultaneously satisfies both. A paper that you get nothing out of isn't really good for you. A paper that the reader doesn't like or doesn't accept doesn't get you anything, so you got to find that balance. That's actually a constant striving back and forth, and so when you're editing, you can sometimes edit from your point of view, but then you have to sit and edit from their point of view. One of the best ways to do this is in between. Actually make this edit cycle include that other person. Maybe not that other person, but some other person who has a different point of view than you, and that'll actually help your writing a lot. So is your process, here's the 3 things I recommend. You have what I'm going to call the pre-write, and I think of that as about 25% of your time, the writing, which is about 25% of your time, and then the rewriting, which is 50% of your time. So depending on how you view the rewrite and the pre-write, you're only spending 25% of your time writing the paper. This is nothing to do with research. This is all just this is the production. This assumes you have the other parts all worked out. So what do you think I mean by pre-writing? Okay, put your goals in the beginning. So that's a structural thing. But yes, what are your goals? So you need to understand what's that. That shouldn't take you a lot of time, though. What might be in pre-writing that's a lot of time? Okay, an outline's a way of expressing your thoughts and your ideas. So that is a kind of, you can do that as part of writing or part of pre-writing. It could be either. What else might be in pre-writing? So your capture ideas. And your capture idea of not just what you want to say. So capturing ideas, but maybe even a little bit more, capturing flows. And we're actually going to go through an exercise to do some of this. Capturing potential flows. So you can imagine that your paper could go A, B, C, D, or it could go A, C, D, B, E. Right? You have lots of orders. Which of those orders make sense? How do I make sense out of those? And when we talk about the storytelling stuff, you'll see that I have put other elements into pre-writing as you have to come up with what these ideas are. So then 25% of your time is actually writing, and then 50% of your time is rewriting, by which I mean editing, reviewing, and rewriting, and throwing stuff away. So if you were thinking about writing a conference paper, how many versions of that paper do you think you'd probably end up having? 20? At least 3. Okay, yeah. Well, at least 3 would be true. So we actually use, and I'll talk about these in more detail in a second, but we use Git as our way of managing our papers. So the last paper I did actually I forgot, I should check what we had with Ethan's paper, but with Avi, the paper we did last year for CVPR, we had 93 revisions of that paper. Okay, so when I talk about rewriting, 93 is a lot of additions, edits to a paper. And this is not like every time we touch the key, we do something. This is, we make it, we say, okay, here's the next version, we check it into Git. Okay, so think of this as like editing your code, you make some changes. You don't check in every little, okay, now we got a consistent block, we check it in. Okay, 93 of those. We have a couple papers that were over 400 iterations. Now that's also true, and it's more common to have more numbers. So the paper that had 400, we had 4 authors in 3 cities, right? So 2 of us were in one, the other were. So now the communication becomes more complicated. So you get more versions that are smaller, and then they edit my version, I edit their version. You get lots of little iterations. For that reason, I really do recommend, if you're going to be a science writer, learn LaTeX and learn to use Git, because if you have to have a hard time to make versions, you won't. You really want the freedom to try out things. So one of the things that will happen in lots of versions is I'll stick in a paragraph. Walter will edit that paragraph. Avi will destroy the paragraph. We'll go through iterations where all these things are changing. But the nice thing with this is that you never lose any of those. How many of you have edited Word? How many of you prefer Word as your editing tool? Okay, and you use track changes? Okay, what happens after about 400 track changes in a document? It's really, really hard to understand what they're doing. One of the nice things about Git is literally every version of this document is a document. I can check it out and build any particular version at any point in time and then reread that and say, yeah, I like that better than that. It is very hard in Word to look at the version 6 times ago in this version and say, which of those paragraphs actually works better for me? It's just not what Word was designed to do. It'll track changes, but it's really hard to say, give me this version of the entire document. You can take any particular edit. But if you do use Word, absolutely use track changes. And actually, I would recommend it for something I've learned in the last 2 or 3 big proposals I worked on in Word. I actually recommend using Word with track changes and Dropbox. Why do you think I recommend Dropbox? Yeah, so Dropbox automatically has version control. So you can actually go to the track change version from 3 days ago, so that you can more easily go back and see what was it then. Because if you edit track changes and then change it again, you only see the final version. You don't see the changes of the changes of the changes. And so having an actual Dropbox or Git or any other repository, but having a repository of every version you've worked on is actually freeing, because you're more willing to make changes because you're not worrying about, well, do I really want this? Am I going to have to go back and change it back again? You just keep all these bits and pieces and put them together.
Now I don't feel so silly for doing that with my school papers.
So you use Git?
Yeah, I used to use Mercurial. I've been
Okay, but
yeah.
Well, Mercurial, Git, CV. I mean, actually, I still have a bunch of papers in CVS.
But yeah, the point
because
is,
that's how long we've been doing.
People give me a hard time because they're like, you're a geek, you version control your whole document. Now I don't feel so stupid because now, you're saying, oh, researchers do it all the time. So
Yes. So.
It's like, oh, geez, I've been doing what they've been doing.
That doesn't mean we're not geeks, though. I can tell you that some of the techniques I'm talking about, other researchers, like the guys I work with in psychology, they did think I was nuts. So, when I put all the documents in Dropbox so we could go back to the versions 8 or 9 ago, they're like, but Word does track changes. It's like, no, it doesn't do the same thing. So, but when we actually had to do a merge and go back to 5 versions ago to get some stuff, they now saw the value. So.
Well, in my case, it was even a programmer that gave me a hard time, like one who knew what version control was. They're like, why would you do that with something that's not code?
Well, see, if you're doing it with LaTeX, it is code.
Still, it's anything that you want to be able to have multiple
versions of, yes.
Research paper.
A paper, right? In fact, so professional editors, professional authors often do have multiple versions. Okay, now many of you have probably used the other version, which is you have a document called version 1. You do track changes for a little while. Then there's version 2. Then you do track changes for a while. There's version 3, and at version 15, each of which have track changes in it, you have lots of stuff. That's a reasonable process if you can keep track of all of it, as long as you can do it. But you don't want to not edit because you're worried that, I'm not sure this is going to work. You want to try out ideas. For many people, including me, well, for me it's mixed. you can't actually tell how well a paragraph or something works until you see it. You can think it's going to work, and then you look at it, you read it, you start reading the paragraph above it, and then all of a sudden there's like a cliff between the two of them. It's like, no, that still doesn't work. So you want to try them out and look at them. And for some people, they have to look at them in close to actual form. Walter, one of my co-authors who I've done lots of papers with, he actually has a hard time reading them on the screen. He wants to see them in paper. Only then does he feel he really gets the content out of them. So,
Is there an application out there where, and maybe LaTeX does this, I just have never used them, but for managing your citations and things, you start to accumulate massive amounts of documents?
So we were here last week. We talked about Zotero, which is a tool for doing that.
Well, I mean all in one app. I mean, is it all synthesized so that
Okay, so yes and no. So Zotero allows you to have different databases. Each database can have as many references as it wants. I don't know how big it gets, but we've got ones with thousands. But the idea of having one central database doesn't actually work because your central database and my central database won't work together because mine's mine and yours is yours. So when we go to write the paper, we have to have ways of having multiple ones all at the same time. Within LaTeX, there's a thing called a BibTeX and a bibliography file, which you can have as many references as you want. Zotero can put them in and out. And then you can have in the same document 9 different bibliographies that get integrated together, and when it LaTeX the document, it produces one bibliography by pulling out of the database. So. Well, so there's lots. So there's RefMan and there's a whole bunch of reference managers. Some are commercial, some are free, and they can manage it. Just don't. I'm just trying to get you to not delude yourself into thinking you can have one master, because as soon as you go to the next paper or the next joint proposal or whatever, your master and their master won't be the same, and it's hard to keep them consistent. But it is good to try and have a couple, right? And then you just work them together in the same document. Okay, so as I said before, you're going to want to balance your reputation, but for many students, the biggest problem is waiting until the work is ready, let alone waiting for it to be perfect. Your biggest problem for almost every student I see who has a problem writing is they're not writing. Okay? It's not that the work's not done, they're just not writing at all. So you write it up. If it's not done, then you can edit it and make it better. Okay? As I just went through, right? Some of our papers have had 90 iterations, some of it a couple hundred, but that paper also went through journal edits and whatever. But Beethoven went through 70 drafts of his symphonies on average. Okay? As William Zinsner, oh, there should have been a link here. He's a good book on writing. It's also another one I can give you. It's free. Rewriting is where the game is actually won or lost. Rewriting is the essence of writing. Good writers write and rewrite. And many of them, which I think is our next slide. So it's the essence of writing. Well, I'm not going to read this whole thing. It's in the slide, so if you want to go through them. But the chance that you're going to write it right the first time is so small anyhow, then don't worry about it. Just write something, and then you can go back and edit it and refine it, edit it and refine it. Now, there are a few people who can just sit down and type out beautiful sentences and great prose. They're by far the exception, okay? And most of them aren't scientists because they can make a much better living as a novelist or whatever. But and a few scientists can do that as well. But most of us, what we put out is garbage. And then it becomes refined ground garbage. And then all of a sudden it starts to actually take form of some sort of stew. And then eventually it becomes actually pretty good. But it's bad. Don't let that worry you, because at least it's writing and then you're rewriting it and refining it. No matter what you do, if you wait longer, you're still going to have a delayed, clunky first draft. So there's actually a couple of papers on what are called shitty first drafts, and I highly recommend you write them. I don't actually recommend starting with an outline, mostly because an outline, you're trying too hard to come up with the right structure, but you don't have all your ideas down yet. You're trying to force yourself to, I'm going to do this from first to end. But often ideas flow haphazardly, so I'm going to recommend you go through you can consider an outline, but think of it as an outline where you fill them in whatever order they come to you. Yeah, there's a good idea. Here's a paragraph. I'll put it over here. Here's an idea. I'll put it over there. And then you start restructuring them after you get done. You do, however, have to have a high-level set of goals. And if that's what you consider your outline, that's okay. You do have to know, where's this paper going? What's it going to say? I don't consider that an outline. But I see people who say, this is section 1.1, 1.2, this is what they say. What I'm going to say in each of those. Now, it's also not hard to write for most papers the sections that are going to occur, because for most papers, the sections are pretty much the same, right? There's the intro, there may or may not be a background research section, then there's some research method section. We'll go through just a couple examples of that in a little bit. So yes, you can do an outline, but it's the same outline every time, so that doesn't get you very far. But you should be putting this down on paper. Only then can you start to rewrite it and then make it an outline. And so that first draft is a different way of getting to the outline, where you take the parts of your brain that work well and stick them all out. So here's another URL. You can go read a little bit more about that. But so don't worry that your first exercise is there. So I'm going to do this first exercise, and hopefully everyone brought something they can use to write. Now, I found this to be true for lots of students, but not all. For many students, actually looking at the words interferes with their thought process. If you close your eyes, you think differently than if you're looking at words on a page, because there's two parts of your brain working. The fast part that is almost subconscious, that is generating ideas and pushing them up to your conscious brain where you're using words. And in your conscious brain, you're also seeing words. And so if you see a word, the conscious part is stuck back here, limiting how fast the other one can put the ideas together and move it forward. So I want you to try this exercise. I want you to think about the paper you want to write. It doesn't really matter to me what it is you want to write about. And in whatever language you're most comfortable in, your native language, whatever that means to you, I want you to do the following exercise where you're going to write about your idea, but you got to do it with your eyes closed. Okay? And I know for some of you, like, how can I write with my eyes closed? I can't see the pen. You will surprise yourself. You actually can. And if you type badly and you have to look at the keyboard when you type, try it anyhow. This is a place where it gets tougher. If you really can't type at all without looking at the keyboard, then I want you to look only at the keyboard and not at the screen. You're not allowed to look at what's on the screen. You can only look at letters. It's still going to limit because you're looking at letters and trying to think out the words. You're going to go slow. But this is an exercise. And if you can, put in a drawing of your ideas, but think about your paper. We're going to do probably 2 or 3 minutes, because I'm actually going to run back to my office and get the next exercise, which I left on my desk. But if you have more than one idea in your paper, and this is where you'll see that the idea of how to outline stuff doesn't really work, write a little bit about each of them. You got to spend at least 30 seconds on this idea before I leave it and jump to the next one. But if you get a bunch of jumbled sentences, that's okay. Okay, so go ahead and start. Something you want to write about. You know, they could also be research ideas that you have yet to write the paper about, but think of the ideas and try writing. Okay, and if you got a piece of paper, just close your eyes and work your way across the page. I'll be right back. And found a storyline. Okay, so who wants to tell me briefly what is their story? Anyone want to volunteer, or do I get to call on somebody? Khalid? Okay. So I wouldn't quite describe what you said as a story, right? You told me what the core idea is, but it isn't a story. So how many people can remember what he just described? Okay. So different question, or?
That's what I was thinking. That was too much.
Okay. So the reason I went through this, in fact, this sort of here at the end is part of it, right? So if you really want people, you want people to remember your work. If they can't remember it, they're not going to accept it, they're not going to cite it, they're not going to use it. So part of the reason I want to focus on a little bit of storytelling is that's probably a reasonably good idea, but you have to present it in a way that people can remember. And so that's the storyline. Now, the storyline in your story is probably still a piece of it there, but we have to think about how to turn it into a broader story element in terms of what's going on. So no one asked me, what did I mean by flow? So did anyone know what I meant when I said look for possible flows?
I looked at the bullets and tried to abstract a sentence out of what was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sentences, and I barely got a sentence out of it.
Okay, so a sentence is not what I meant by a flow, but that's okay. So a sentence is a sentence, right? So a flow to me is if you have a bunch of ideas, what order are you going to present them in, and how do you connect them? Okay, which is actually a sub-element of a story. A story's got a continuous flow from the beginning to end. It's got a bunch of elements in it. But when you first have a bunch of jumbled ideas, the question is, how do you relate them? Which one goes first? Maybe. So there are in fact many flows. There's no right answer. The answer to what flows depends on both what your ideas are and how you connect with other people. Now, when we talk about writing a paper, we will use a hourglass pyramid kind of thing in terms of scope, but that's not necessarily the flow of ideas. The first idea might actually be something very small that anyone can connect to, so then they feel connected, and then you might broaden out the idea. So there's lots of directions on how that will go. Okay. It's getting closer. So, and so I'm going to ask you to rethink about that storyline now. But I really, apologize, Joseph, this is a little harder for you, but I want the rest of you to think of this as though you were trying to draw this as a cartoon with stick figures, and you have to name everything. So if you want to have a game, it's a character. Think of it in an anthropomorphic sense. It's a person. It's got body parts or whatever. I want you to think about how to tell the same storyline you just did, but make them into characters that interact with each other. And I know it sounds really weird, but I want you to try and think in sort of shapes and pictures and characters of your story. Okay? And it'll be a little bit of a stretch, but please, we'll take a minute and try that. You can have your eyes open. Although for many of us, I don't think drawing will be better or with or without. You don't actually have to draw them. I'm just imagining in your head that you're now doing this, but it's visualizing your storyline. But then you can sort of rewrite your storyline in terms of those actual characters.
What if mine were so disjointed that it was just basically I haven't gotten to the actual write the paper part.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still trying to figure out exactly what I want to write.
Okay, well that's fine. So you have these abstract ideas.
Everything
Right.
is disjointed, yeah.
Well, so.
Questions. I'm like, well, what about this? What about this?
Okay, so then your character's a 2-year-old who keeps saying why and what. I'm just trying to find a way to get you to think about visualizing this as interactions among people, even though it's science. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, and I know it seems really weird in the beginning. It seems really weird after you're doing it for a while too. So. What's over there? Typos. Okay, so if you've been visualizing this now I want you to go back and try and actually think of those things and try and make them into a more meaningful story where you actually now name the characters and talk about how the characters interact. So since we only did one story, and each of you can do this on your own, but think about how you would do that as stories. Now, even for Joe's example where things were disjoint ideas, if you think about how characters would interact with each other, except for a few weird abstract plays or whatever, they're not random ideas interacting, right? They find a way to connect things. So that's part of what you're looking for is how do I bridge this idea to that idea? And that allows you to then begin telling this as though it was a story where this element is connected to that. It may mean rearranging your ideas. And it may mean that some of them don't fit. Okay? There's nothing wrong with that. Even at this early stage, your paper in the end should be about one idea, not 6. If it's 6 ideas, it's a bad paper. Some people think that adding more makes it better. Adding more makes it confusing. A good paper should have one idea. Now, that one idea might decompose into 6 little elements, but there's one fundamental idea. And if it becomes a sitcom where some random person walks in the room and says something and leaves, you know what? Jettison that person, except for Steinfeld, where it sometimes works with Kramer. The rest of it doesn't. People want a continuous storyline of what's going on. So take those ideas that didn't fit, and you might have gone from 6 ideas on your page to 2. If you can only connect 2, keep those 2. The other 6 might be useful later. So see if you can connect them. So does anyone be able to connect by doing any of this drawing stuff? Is it? No. Everyone's looking at me like I'm a complete lunatic right now. Okay, well. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears. We will get to an example from some of mine in just a little bit. But first I want to tell a little bit more about story writing, because people aren't very good at either persuading or story writing. So I'm going to lecture a little bit here. We'll go a little faster to catch up. I'm a little behind. But so you're writing for a proposal, a paper. You're really getting to change people. Your goal is to persuade them to use your science, give you money, let you go on to the next stage of your PhD, give you a PhD, whatever, right? All of that is persuasion. So it's not writing to make them feel happy. This is not poetry. This is persuasion. So I'm going to talk about the 5 key elements of persuasive presentations, persuasive writing. Okay. First, think action-oriented with style. You want to think about stuff that keeps people energized, because if they stop reading your paper, they're done reading your paper, right? You got to keep them energized. Okay. You want to think about things in terms of its impact, not as information. A lot of people think they're writing a paper to give away information or to convey information. That is not why you're writing a paper. You're writing a paper to have an impact on the reader. That might involve information, but it's mostly to have an impact on them. So you really don't want to be boring. You don't want to put them to sleep. You don't want to make them be yawning as you're doing this. And if they are, you want to change it. So be far more active. A lot of people think of science writing should be abstract, disjoint, third party. You'll in fact read, there are entire books on proper science should be written in the third person, right, with passive voice all over the place. It's just bad science. So the next thing is you want something to be sticky, and we'll talk a lot more about stickiness. Stickiness means when you get done, they can remember what it is. And guess what? Word count and stickiness and energy levels are inversely correlated. If your work sounds boring, they're not going to remember what your work was. If you have lots of energy and excitement and action, they're going to be more able to remember your work. And it'll be stickier. So word count's bad, energy good, and both of them, right, are related to how sticky things will be. So as you do that, you want to keep it together. The second, which is in some sense the most important, but you can actually get a lot of people following work, and this is at a broader presentational level, even if they have no idea what's going on. If I have a lot of energy, people will stop and listen, even if there's nothing in it for them, because they're actually just listening. The energy draws them in to figure out, oh, there's something exciting here. Maybe I should be in on this. But after that first level of energy, the next most important thing is what's in it for them. If you can't get across to them what's in it for them, then why are they reading it? Okay, now, reviewers have a different goal. What's in it for them is they want to decide what's the best paper to put in the conference. But that's still what's in it for them. It may not be what's in the paper for them, it's what's in the process for them, but it's still what's in it for them. So you need to figure out what you're going to do for that. And there might be some need to dangle a carrot out there to get them excited. Right? Even before you've told me how you're going to do it or proven to me that you're going to do it, in your introduction, you've told me that this work can be used to solve the following 8 problems. And if one of those problems is one of those 8s, you've now told them that there's something in it for them. You've given them a reason to slog through the rest of your paper because there's something in it for them. And if you've got an audience and you can't figure out what's in it for them, then this is the time to abandon this paper and move on to the next one. Find one that somebody will care about, because there's got to be some audience for which you're writing for it. So think about what's in it, and you really want to prove and prepare to prove what's in it for them. Your experiments in your paper are all to prove that what you said is in it for them is actually in it for them. That's the whole point of the experimental process in what you're doing in your paper. Okay, so you want to think of this in terms of your writing in terms of benefits, not features. Don't tell me a system has X or a system, has these features. Tell me what's the benefit. The system runs 40% faster than previous algorithms. Don't tell me that it has a VP tree, right? That's might be how you get 40% faster, but what's important to them is it runs 40% faster. So lead with a benefit. You might follow up with the features that let you get there because it adds credibility to your benefit. Think of it in terms, again, as I said, impact in terms of what they're going to do. Features need to explain to make the benefits credible. So after I've got the benefits, you can add those features in. Okay? And then work in the benefits again, but this time as a call to action. So in your introduction to your paper, which is the beginning that most people are going to read, and a little bit in the abstract, focus on benefits, not features. You read lots of papers where people tell me what they did. And I'm wondering, well, why do I care what you did? First, I want to know what's in it for me and how am I going to benefit from that, and then I'll figure out if what you did matters enough. Okay, the next one seems a little bit odd for science, but you want to look at about how to build emotion. And so there's a little fish hook over there on the left, right, whichever side that is, because you got to hook them. And this is true if you've taken any creative writing classes. They always talk about sort of a hook that gets them into your paper. You need to get them in. But after that, you want to keep building up. So there's sort of little bits of crescendo. You get them a little bit excited, and then you know what? There's a little bit of boring section, and it gets them a little more excited. You want to keep that crescendo building up enough until there's a point where you have a call for action. Now, this isn't necessarily the structure of the whole paper. This can be the structure of every section of the paper, which is why you have these little crescendos leading up to big ones. There could be another little set of bumps in there. Okay? But the conclusion of your paper is your grand finale. So in a sense, this is the energy and emotion in your things. Come on. So that call to action is important. Now, when you go to do that, right, you want to remember that it's not just about the words you say; it's also about figures. So imagine that people actually read everything out loud in the paper. Now, that sounds terrible, and this is one of the other reasons, by the way, I recommended you actually listen to your papers, not just read them. For many of you, the first time if you use one of these read-aloud programs, you will find, boy, this paper is going really slow, right? Unless you've played at 2x or 3x speed, which then it sounds okay. But if that's slow to you while you're listening to the paper, it's also slow to the audience. You got to keep that going and keep it going out. So, and when you can, add graphics. Okay, so the next issue is sort of structure and scannable elements. 79% of people don't read; they scan. We just taught you how to scan. People who are doing science for a living scan a lot. They browse a lot and scan a little, and then they read far less. So if you can't hook them in the scan, they're done, right? So what does that mean? Well, that means you want to have things like bullets and heading and bold and italics and spacing that keeps them reading but also gets them, oh, yes, there's something important here I have to do. In that scan, they've got to get enough information. They're also going to expect things to be in place, sections and orders for different subfields. Even in computer science, they're going to have different expected orders. Whatever the conference or journal you're writing for has as an order, use it. I don't recommend radically different things than what other people are doing in terms of that, because the reviewers will skip over stuff and not find it. And of course, actually, the first sentences of every paragraph is key, because again, that's a technique you were taught to do this. Well, lots of people do that stuff naturally, so you really want to make sure that those are clear. Images should say more value than just a copy of what's going on. Graphics, you want good qualities of those when you get done. Again, captions get read by 50% more prospects than the body copy, and often have nearly 100% recall. So this is true. This is actually from broader, not just science reading. But if people read a magazine article that's got figures and captions, they'll forget most of the article, but they'll remember almost everything that was in the figures and captions. Why? Because they tied the graphics and the words together, they get more out of it. So you want to remember to add some of those. Oops. So now you can actually combine four, whatever the numbers were, 3 and 4, 4 and 5, making your crescendo work in. So you can talk about from your paper, your headline, the beginning, the title, the first sentences, then your lead in the introduction that gets them into the paper. You're going to have some proof where you put some stuff in, your bullets, your call to action. All of these things are really building up to your final ending. Okay, so you have subheadings, you have elements that go into it, and that allows you to combine those two. So the last element of effective persuasion is it has to stick. This is especially true when you're looking at reviewing processes. If a reviewer's got to review 13 papers and they're going to compare them at the end, part of it when they go to make their comparison is literally which ones do I remember. I've been on panels with reviewers for proposals where we're like, so what was that other proposal? And we know that the name of the author, we know that none of us can remember a single detail from the proposal. What do you think its chances of getting funded are? Not very good, right? None of us can remember what was in it. It wasn't that compelling. So you want to think about how to make things sticky, and that leads us to this acronym called SUCCESS. So SUCCESS is an acronym for sticky stories. They are simple. They have something in them that's unexpected. They are concrete, credible. They have some emotional attachment, and they're a story, and together that makes them stick. Okay, so you want to be successful. You can remember success. So simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional stories stick. Okay, and you want to plan for that. So you want to plan for how I'm going to have, first of all, a simple story, but it has to have something that's unexpected. If there's nothing unexpected, if the reviewer thinks there's nothing unexpected in your paper, what do you think they're going to think about it? They're going to Well, if there's nothing unexpected, then it was all known before I read the paper. Why? There's nothing new in this paper. There's nothing accepted. There's nothing novel here. Get rid of it, right? We don't need this paper. You have to think about what is the unexpected surprise that your viewer is going to get out of it. And it's funny because sometimes people work very hard to make it so obvious that this is a good idea that it's so obvious that they don't think it's a good idea, right? You want to actually have a little bit of it. It's not, when you first present it, it's going to be like, wow, where did that come from, right? Now you've got them thinking it's unexpected, and then it actually starts to stick with them when you show them how, okay? It's got to be concrete, so it's really hard to have very ephemeral things that people can remember. Now, the concreteness might not be real. You might make it concrete by relating it to things they already understand, and then you extend their thought process. It needs to be credible in the sense that they have to believe you can do it. You may or may not be able to prove it all, but your experiments lead towards your credibility, and there's a bunch of other elements that go into what's credible. And if it's not credible, you better have a really good other explanation. As I said, I had this paper where I had results that no one believed in the beginning, which was actually true. They were right to not believe it, but I didn't get it. I eventually came up with a story that convinced them it might work. So it became credible even though the experiments seemed almost incredulous. And emotional. So we're science. Do you think we should be unemotional? Some people believe science should be dispassionate. Okay, I'm going to argue that it shouldn't be. You should be dispassionate in the sense that you want to find the truth, good or bad. You don't go in saying, I'm going to prove this is true just to prove it's true and do whatever it takes, right? It either is true or it's not. But you need to convince your audience to care. Do people care about things they have no emotion about? Probably not. So you want to evoke some level of emotion. And then we're going to talk a lot more about stories next. So what's the core of a story? Well, in my view, the core of a story is some character that's going to have to overcome some problems and conflicts, and along this road, it's going to have some risks and dangers to get to their goal. Right? So those are the elements, or the core of a story is our stick figure guy trying to get to his goal, but along the way, some things are going to stop them. Okay? Now, does that sound like science? Well, it really is. So these are the 8 elements that are essential for a character. Actually, these are the 8 normal elements. I have an even more restricted set in a second. So you're going to have some characters and character traits. So what might be a character in science? The reviewers. Reviewers are not characters in the sense of my story. So they are players or actors, but characters are in my story. So unless I'm writing about reviewers, they're not a character in my story. But let's say I'm just taking a straight-up operating systems paper. Right? Really exciting stuff. Right? The problem could be the character. The algorithm could be the character. Okay? One of those two is probably the character. I actually often can think of the system or the algorithm you're developing. That's your main character. This is the character that's going to overcome the conflicts and problems, the obstacles of the problem to solve it. Okay? By character details, we talk about the things that make it interesting. If your algorithm is really boring, no one's going to really like your algorithm. You want to make it have some interesting details, some interesting characters. Oh, look, it's fast, it's simple, it's efficient, it's small. Some dimensions in which you care about your algorithm. You're defining your problem, so you get to say these are dimensions that matter. You got to convince me they matter, but those are the traits of your algorithm that are going to be interesting. Okay, maybe it's extensible. There's lots of different dimensions. Okay, so these are the two things, and I put them in red because if you can't come up with here's the character and make them sound interesting, you really don't have much of a story. So when I asked you to draw, did anyone draw when they started thinking about their character, their actual algorithm as their character? Anyone? No? Now that I've said it, can you look back and say, I can see how I could make that into a character? Okay. Now, one of the things that I also do that makes it a little bit farther is some algorithms have wonderful names like C4.5, okay, which is not that bad. I mean, C3PO was a cute character, so I guess R2D2 is cute, C3PO is a installer. Name your characters. I recommend if you're going to have an algorithm, come up with a name that's memorable. Why? Because if people can't remember it, they can't refer to your algorithm. Algorithm 4.1 really isn't a very memorable name, C4.5. Make up a word, make up an acronym, make it into something people can pronounce, and it makes it far more memorable. Heck, we have our new postdoc's algorithm is called Bob. Okay? It's memorable, not very unique, but it's Bob. So you're going to have a goal. What's your goal in your paper? You want to make it faster. You want to solve some part of your problem. So your character is to get to that goal. There's some motive. Now, what's motive going to be for your character? We know what the goal is, but what's motive? What real-world things care about the solution to this problem? Okay. Well, process might be part of it, but at a deeper level, there's hopefully some real-world problems that you're related to. So those motives might be stopping suffering, reducing cost overages, right? If I can do it faster, cheaper, better, there's some reason I want to do this. I'm going to improve human lives in some way. If I can relate that to that, that's a strong motive. The conflicts and problems are, if this goal was trivial, then I wouldn't need to have a problem, right? So there won't be much of a story. Risks and dangers go with that, and I'll talk about that. And then the struggles. All of these are really about overcoming to go from the initial state to the goal state, satisfying the motives, and these make the story more interesting and fun. So I'm going to go through these a little bit quicker. So I'm not going to read these all, but now this is sort of a summary for your things. For each of those, giving you a definition. Who is the main character? What character traits make them interesting? What do the characters need to do to get there? That's the goal. Why is that goal important? What conflicts do we have? And so on. Okay. Now, when we're starting to tell the story, especially in the beginning, organization is far more important than grammar. Okay. Why? Because you can easily fix grammar and you can get somebody to help you with grammar. It's your story. Only you can tell that. There are people that probably know more about grammar than you do, but maybe not. Maybe you're the grammatician as well. But organization is more important. People will not, grammatical errors are bad. You'll get papers rejected if you have grammar errors, but you can fix grammar in the last day. You can't rewrite a sequence in the last day. It's really hard to completely rewrite your paper. So an illogical sequence of ideas. Why am I reading about this at this point in time? Why don't I yet know the big picture? It is amazing how many papers jump into details without giving us the big picture and letting us understand where it is. And that destroys the paper. If I'm jumping around, I think the next one is no pattern of organization. Right? Is it moving from most important to least? Okay, there are two good orders for science. There's lots of other orders you can use to write, but the only two the most useful one is from the most important idea to the least important idea. Okay, if I stop after having read the first section, I should know the most important stuff. I shouldn't have to read the details first, only to get to it. And this is backwards for some people. They want to build up to this big crescendo, okay, which I did talk about emotionally. You want there to be a crescendo at the end, but that's not in terms of holding back the best idea, right? The most important idea should be up there. Now, how to get there is a different question, okay? So the second order in which things are often done are because you're following a standard order where you're relating it to the way other people have done stuff. Then it's not always the most important. Sometimes you talk about what is the state of the art, and then you add your idea first. Well, you're supposed to beat the state of the art, so the most important thing wasn't first, but you have to set the context for your problem, and that's allowed. Okay, chronological. This is the order in which I did the research is a really bad idea. Okay, it doesn't matter that that's the way you did it, right? No one cares how you did it unless you're writing an autobiography. They only care what it is and how they're going to build on it. And then finally, or I guess not finally, but next is no flow of ideas. If you feel as though you're starting over with each new sentence, or if I read a paragraph, and it's really the next one is the jumping, right? If I read a paragraph and then the next paragraph has no connection to it, people feel that's not well organized. A single sentence that connects the two paragraphs to tell me why, if I was talking about A, now I'm talking about B, makes a huge difference in terms of how well people will do this. So this, again, one of the things you're going to want to do at the end is make sure that organization is there as you go through these items. So the way I like to talk about this is an ordering I call Oscar. There's lots of other variations of this, but Oscar is something I can remember. You want to do a good job writing, so you want to win an Oscar, so that's Oscar. Or you can think of a little grouchy. Isn't Oscar the blue guy in the green? Grouch. Yeah, Oscar's the grouch. Yeah. So anyhow, you want to have all of your, this is really, in good science stories, this is the order you will generally find. Okay, now, in fact, the order, so Oscar stands for opening, the science that sets the stage, the challenge, the action, and the resolution. And the science, this will actually be true in lots of stories without science, and then you just drop the word science. This is just a good order for stories in general, an opening, setting the stage, the challenge, the action, and the resolution. And the resolution is a resolution of what you had back in the opening. Now, in terms of the writing in your problem, this is often referred to as sort of an hourglass shape because the opening is very broad. You want to get people interested. This is very, very broad. It'll solve lots of stuff. You then narrow it down in the setting the stage and the challenge. When you get to the actual problem to a narrow thing, you actually solve the narrow thing, and then the resolution is also opening that back up. Okay, so you're going to tie a lot of people into that. And Oscar is recursive. Oh, no, it's not the next slide. But so in the rest of science, and actually this is still related, we'll come back and relate this, there's another ordering technique called IMRAD, which is the way I've heard it pronounced, so IMRAD. And that's the introduction, the methods, the results. The A either stands for analysis and discussion or and discussion, depending on what subgroup you're looking at. And there's literally journals that say this is the suggested order in which you put your paper. Computer science, you'll actually very rarely see sections called methods and results. In our field, we end up with something where we have either a number of methods we're going to directly compare, or it's more complicated, so we don't actually call it methods, because methods are true if I'm just going to go study something. In our case, we're going to describe the thing we're going to build. So we'll often end up with a section which is the algorithm or the system description, followed by an experimental section that actually has both the methods and the results put together. Sometimes the results are so complicated they need to be discussed immediately, in which case you end up with a section instead of something called results, you end up with results and discussions where you have, here's an experimental result, here's its discussion. Here's the experimental result, here's the discussion. Because if your paper actually has 3 experiments, it's really annoying to read a paper that says, here's a bunch of data, here's a bunch of data, here's a bunch of data, now here's a description of what this one means, and here's a description of what that one means. Most people in computer science will interleave those into something that gives you a results and discussion section, which is often also just called the experimental section. So we may not have a section called discussion. Okay. So if I sort of put these two together, we can actually see that they're not independent. They're just two different ways of looking at often the same thing. A section called setting or challenge would be very weird. Oscar is a way to think about what you're writing. IMRAD is a way of thinking about how to organize what the sections of your paper are, right? But in the introduction, you're probably going through the overall Oscar, but you're trying to open, set the stage, and define the challenge. That's what I want to do in the intro section. In the methods and results section, I'm looking at action, 2 parts. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's the numbers that came out of what I did. And then the discussion is the equivalent of the resolution. But I hate the word discussion. Discussion is a terrible idea because I don't care if you discuss it. If you don't resolve something, if you don't show me an answer, then discussion is just talk. Okay? So resolution is more what you're trying to get out of it. So these two are sort of run in parallel sections in there, what you want to do. Okay? This is just to remind me that it's time to take a break. So sometimes you want to, when you're doing this, you're not always going to get what you want out of this process, but you might get what you need out of this process. So when we're going through this, we're going to start about stories after break. We'll take a 5-minute bio break, and then we'll continue on and talk about storytelling. So, okay? Story time. I should have brought milk and cookies. Okay, so context provides the surrounding parts that determine the meaning in the background. Okay, so implying a close relationship or importance in terms of what they're going to want to do in terms of the ingredients that make your story parts work. So applying prior knowledge is how we actually remember. If we don't connect what we hear, see, or read to what's already stored in our head, we can't learn it. Okay, babies have some things, but even for them, it's a long time before they can do it. So I'm going to give you, Joe, sorry for this, but I'm going to give you 10 groups with 25 letters total. And in 10 seconds, without writing it down, I want you to see how many of these you can remember. Okay? So on average, how many do you can recall? Well, the average will be around 10 letters. Okay? In fact, the 7 plus or minus 2 didn't quite work because there was a small group of letters there that actually you read as a word map. Right? You probably saw IB, map, and whatever. But context and knowledge make things easier or harder to resolve. And so in this case, spacing is part of what invoked knowledge. You read them as spaced the way I wrote them, at least most of you did. 1 or 2 people smiled. So if you're like me, this exercise, by the way, doesn't work for me because spacing doesn't matter so much to me. But that's what the words say in order. Do you think you remember them now? IBM, Apple, Microsoft, AT&T, and Twitter? It's the same letters, just slightly different spacing. Okay? That's context, spacing, and power. Prior knowledge, now that you know what those things are, right? And if I told you to ignore the spaces, once you know to ignore the spaces, you can't not see this one and just connect them all together and then see all the subwords. Okay? So we'll do one more quick one. Just Joseph.
So, and this is, as a blind person, I don't know this. This is going to be obvious to everybody else. But if you say ignore the spaces, but then you present something on the screen that's got these really whacked out spaces, is it really possible to ignore the spaces?
I don't know.
Does your brain just go, no?
Well, so to other people, now that you know to ignore the spaces, can you ignore the spaces and see them? Yeah.
Okay.
So.
I saw Twitter before you told me.
Okay. So yeah, Twitter's a more unique word, so it's a little harder to hide some of those and break them up. But Joe, for you, think of it as if someone told you to ignore this temporal spacing of stuff, and they said some words. You just have to sort of suspend in between. It's harder. It's not as obvious as seeing the correct words, but you can still connect them because you know to try and link them together.
I just didn't know if, like, visually, if the spaces were funny and you told someone ignore it, could they really do that? You know, I don't. I just don't know how.
Not as well. So, but some people like me have spaces or largely optional characters. So try and remember the following phrases. Okay. For some of you, this will be harder than others. John walked up the roof. Bill picked up the eggs. Pete hid the axe. Jim flew the kite. Frank built the boat. Harvey flipped the electric switch. Ted wrote the play. So can you remember who did what? How many of those can you remember? Who built the boat? Who flew the switch? Most people have no way of remembering this stuff because I just asked you to connect a bunch of irrelevant things. Now let's try them in the following ways, which culturally will still be hard for some people because these are other random names. Santa Claus walked on the roof. The Easter Bunny picked up the eggs. George Washington hid the axe. Benjamin Franklin flew the kite. So if you're an American, Western-oriented person, many of these are now trivial to remember because these are cultural references in American culture that you have no problem. Who flew the kite? Well, that was Ben Franklin, right? Yes, Tom Edison, right? And who wrote the play? Shakespeare. Okay, so prior knowledge is critical. Now, some of you have been at family parties where family members are telling stories and you have no idea what they're talking about. Okay, or maybe they're in fact in-laws. They're even worse because then you have no shared context. But your spouse gets everything. They have a shared context. Well, guess what? In the world of science, you are talking in a family that as new students You're the outsider getting in. The facts you think everyone knows, because that's what you've been studying, they may or may not know. And the fact that everyone knows that you barely studied and therefore think are new and relevant, they may think of as old hat. Okay, so you got to get that balance of what's that context, because you got to go for their body of knowledge. Okay, and you got to remember the curse of knowledge. Once you know something, it's almost impossible to remember what it was like to not know it. This becomes especially true when you become a professor, when you got to teach. So once you know, you tend to write as though the easier reader also knew. You're trying to use the references that you're using, but they don't have yet. Okay, so that's actually one of the hardest parts for writing, is breaking that back down to what will somebody who doesn't know what I'm talking about, what will they think about? So when you're writing this from the audiences, you got to talk about their banks of knowledge. You got to connect it to what they know. So one of the reasons that the prior work section, or in what I called in Oscar, the setting the scene, is so important is because you need to give them a frame of reference to understand your work in a context, not just because you have to beat the state of the art, but because without that reference, they can't understand what it is you do. So that's the first introduction. It's not actually the absolute state of the art. It's the stuff that's most relevant to help them understand. You got to remember, you're doing this not from your point of view, and not necessarily from the best scientist, but from the average audience member. So you have that reviewer and some other audience members. You got to write it so that the average one of those has the body of knowledge to understand your connection. They may not understand all the implications. You're going to tell them those implications, but they have to have that body of knowledge. It's still good in a paper to have 1 or 2 paragraphs that are for the best scientists, because you don't want them saying, oh, this is all trivial, right? This is obvious, okay? There's some stuff there that can be deep, but the most of it, the body of knowledge you assume they know, needs to be for the average person. There are people in my field that know extreme value theory, but I can't write my papers assuming the readers know extreme value theory. In fact, if they know extreme value theory, they may not need to read my papers. The experts are the ones who don't need it. So you're writing for these other people. Okay, so, and facts are made relevant by turning it into a story. So there's elements of a story, goal, people, conflict, or whatever. So let's take a really stupid example. Mother pours milk into a glass. So that's an event. Okay, now, is that a story? Not really. There's no goal, there's no motive, there's no conflict, or whatever. It's also not particularly memorable. And scientists often bury lots of their stuff and make implicit assumptions. So they just tell me the facts. Mother poured milk into a glass. Okay, a little bit of embellishment makes it much more of a story. Mother's left side has been paralyzed by a crippling stroke. She fights to regain the use of her left hand and arm. For the first time, she tries a complex action with her left hand, and she's determined to pour the milk to prove that she can. You'll probably remember that story a week from now, right? Because it's got enough elements that you can imagine this, you can see it, you can visualize it, and that makes it a sticky story. There's some unexpected elements and whatever goes on with it. So now let's talk about the process. So you have to do 2 things. You have to merge your information, your content, with an effective story structure. Okay? We're not talking about telling a story that's irrelevant to your stuff. You have information you want to convey. So your goal is to find that balance and get them together. So you want to come up with this idea of a theme or a takeaway message. Your paper should have a simple takeaway message. This does this. This leads to that. Very simple. You need to articulate that and write it down and make sure you're clear on what the message is. When you're unclear what that message is, your paper reflects that and your paper has stuff all over it. If you have 2, the 2 have to be so tightly related that there's a super story, a super theme, that's got 2 pieces. This is done by doing A and B. That's okay. You can have A and B in a paper, but they got to be related. Okay. I recommend you try and search for a core metaphor. And I'll talk about what metaphors in 2 slides. And then you want to define your story characters. As I said, most likely your character is your algorithm, your system, but sometimes your character is actually a real person. I do privacy work, and in privacy work, very often the character I choose to make is not me, but the person whose privacy is going to be violated. You're telling a story about why this is important, and it becomes memorable. Okay? It could be the user, the end user is your character. That's okay. But you want to define a primary character, and then you're going to build the elements around them so that you give your character some detail. They have a goal and an obstacle, and you want to tell that story. And even if that story is just in the introduction, you're going to relate back to it all the time. Audience can keep there. And so you're going to build that in with a metaphor and then the justice for your audience and your media. You're going to connect them. I want to be clear on the difference between themes and goals. So your goal is for your character. My system wants to do this. My person wants to do that. That's a character goal. It should be viable. It defines the story's ending. It defines how we've actually shown we've gotten to where we needed to be. It creates purpose and meaning for the story. That's your science story. And it's very general because this is true for all stories, but science stories have this structure if you do them right. Now the theme is for the reader. It relates to the human condition. It relates to their background knowledge, and it's what you want the reader to be able to connect to and understand stuff. The reader can view the character in third party. I can see the system is doing this. The theme helps them understand that to give them a way to interpret the characters and the events that are going on. The characters need not at all be aware of the theme. Right? If the character is a person or if the character is a system, it doesn't know the theme. The theme is something you use to convey the story. The goal is part of the story. Okay, so the theme is your core message. The story becomes your message to communicate that and help it stick. So even though I gave you the 8 essential elements, you can do a little bit less. So your character needs something because of some goal, but something is making this hard, so we do this and finally we can conclude this. This can literally be a single sentence story that you could have in your intro and your conclusion. Depends on how you want to do it. Right? So you change tenses, you can put it in your conclusion. But this really is setting up your story. And you should be able to look at your paper and say, these 6 elements, so we got rid of 2. We don't have to have all the details about the characters, and we don't have to have risk and danger in science stories. But you do have to have something you have to overcome. So why do I have to overcome something? Why does it have to be a challenge to overcome? Because again, if I didn't have a challenge, then I don't need to do this work. Right? It's not necessary. It's not obvious. Okay? So I already did this one. I wanted to put it in, make sure I cover it. When we do Oscar, I actually recommend you sort of think of the Oscar orientation of ordering sort of recursively. It's at the paper level. So in fact, this layout, opening, setting, challenge equals introduction, action equals methods and results, resolution equals discussion, that's the paper level view of Oscar. But Oscar can be reapplied at the section level. So when I have a section on, say, methods or experiments, I'm going to have an opening for that. I'm going to set the stage for the experiment. I'm going to talk about how I'm going to do, what's the challenge in this experiment that I want to overcome. I'm going to have some action and then some resolution from the experiment. So that's the experimental section. It, too, is Oscar. Okay? And then inside a paragraph, a good paragraph has an opening, generally some level of action inside of it. You want some action motion going on, and then even a resolution. The conflict may or may not be in every paragraph. At the sentence level, you can still apply Oscar, although by the time you get down to the sentence level, you're often missing some parts because this sentence is the opening, right? But a sentence has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So it's got pieces that you can always put together. But at sentence level, you often vary them a lot more. Okay. Once you have your story's ideas, you want to focus on organizing that story to the reader to make it memorable and put it together. And you got to figure out how to frame those items. So what do you see in this on the screen? Sorry, Joe. There's 4 boxes of different colors and textures. What do you guys see? Could you? And you're not sure. Okay. So, but could you tell a story that connects these? Yeah. So think of this as what happens when you focus on little pieces in your story. It's a lot easier if you can frame this and frame what's important. Those are all just little pieces out of a scene where we have a chair on the grass by the ocean with a rocky shore. Right? That story of describing in that way, you get all those pieces. Yes, this might be the piece of wood that I wanted to talk about, but overall, setting 1 or 2 sentences that set that frame, and once you've framed what's important, the order in which you tell that story is important. I started with the chair. In this picture, is the chair the most important thing? Doesn't have to be. Depends on what you want out of this picture. In the context of your story and your elements, you have to say what's important. This is why I said earlier, temporal order of the way you did stuff is a bad idea. You want to go what's most important first and lead with that. But frame the big picture. So coming back to what was said, you do want this big picture view. You got to give them the big picture and then get down to what you want to focus on so they can put that stuff in context, which we call framing. Okay, so openings, these are critical to framing every paper. The first sentence is actually, or should be, very audience specific. The first sentence for a scientist and the first sentence for a general audience are going to be very different. You got to get them to care differently. So you got to figure out what's going to hook them. In fact, the same paper, same core paper, sent to a, say, a machine learning conference and a computer vision conference, even if it's the same core algorithm, have to be very different because those two audiences have different objectives. You got to hook them in terms of where they're going to go. It's worth spending a lot of time on this for abstract and the introduction, and for the conclusion, you really want to rework those openings. If in the first 2 or 3 sentences when you were scanning, you weren't excited, what did you want to do? Skip. That's the whole point of scanning, especially when you're forcing yourself to go fast. This doesn't get me excited. I'm not hooked in. Just maybe skip to the next section, or maybe just give up on the paper.
Browsing too? I said, doesn't that apply in browsing?
It applies even in browsing. So in browsing, you're looking at a smaller section. So if that's the way people are going to read your paper, you have to write knowing that's what most audiences are doing. They're trying not to read your paper. You've got to give them reason to keep going and hook them in. So make that opening, really hook them in, and spend some time on it. So the next section in Oscar is setting the science, sort of setting the scene. So the intro should have a little bit of the science, what's most relevant, okay? And in doing this, you're trying to set, you also want to make sure you set up non-standard terms. So if I'm going to use a term that is not common knowledge, I should define it. I should also be careful not to define terms that are common knowledge. It doesn't matter what's common knowledge to me. What really matters is what's common knowledge in the field. So if I look through last year's conference proceedings and I can't find the term, then don't presume it's common knowledge. If I can find the term and I didn't know what it was, doesn't matter, it is common knowledge. So use last year's publications as a good way of gauging that. Okay? This section in the intro is not a literature review. Your goal here is not completeness. It is relevance. Okay? Many papers will have another section called related work. There you want a little bit more completeness. But here, you're in the intro just trying to introduce 2 or 3 things that let them understand that you're framing the problem, what's it related to, and also to convince them to get some credibility for your problem, that others are working on related problems. If you have a problem that is so new that no one works on it, if you write in the intro, no one else is addressing this problem, what do you think that tells the rest of the reviewers and the readers? Nobody else cares. Okay? So you have to have related work. You have to say that stuff is there because you want to show them that everyone cares. Now, the other thing I really recommend is, it's not always the case, but in general, in doing this when you're referring to this other work, be extremely positive. Say how wonderful and important that work is. Why? Because if you're going to extend something that's bad, that's probably not very good. You want to extend something that's wonderful and important, and you're going to make it even better. Okay? Even if there's some problems in the work, don't talk about those in the intro. You got to leave enough room, however, for you to actually talk about what your work is going to set up and what it's going to do. So actually, no, so now it's time for the other exercise. So, and again, Joe, I'm not used to having a blind student in class, so I will email you these so you can review them later, but for class I have this paper. So everyone take one, pass those back and send them around. Actually, here, give me half the pile. I'll go to the other side of the room. Just keep going back with those. So these are 2 different versions of the same paper. This is one of our papers I've already mentioned that we were working on last year. This is actually the paper. One of these 2 is the paper is submitted. The other is the paper. Actually, can I keep one? There'll be extras at the back of the room. Like I was looking. So I want you to read the first couple of sentences of the abstract, and we will talk about them, both abstracts. Joe, if I send you the PDF now, would that be helpful?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so people are you still reading? Okay. Yes. Sorry. You don't have to read the whole abstract, just the first couple of sentences. I don't want to. Yeah, just the first part of the abstract. We will, if you're done reading the abstract, you can start reading some of the other stuff. But how many people are still reading the abstracts? Hands? Okay, we'll give you another couple minutes. We're going to talk about the abstract and then the intro. But I want to take it back. Neither of these is the version as submitted, but must have been one version before it. I have to go back into CVS and check out an old version. I must have read the wrong log and one before the one before the submission. So I'm going to refer to these in two different ways. Oh, she's marked it all up. So yeah, that's when I notice how much writing you're doing. It's like, I better check this. It's like, oh yeah, no, we fixed that. That's not there. So I'm going to refer to this as the numbered version and the unnumbered version. Okay. Which of these do you think is closer to the submitted version, since neither one is actually the submitted version? Numbered or unnumbered? Numbered or unnumbered?
I think it's the one that's April 13.
Well, yeah, you get the file names. That helps. So the unnumbered one is closer to submission. There are still typos in it.
I thought you meant with the date on it.
Oh, yeah, no. So one of the pages have numbers on the side.
Oh, yeah, I noticed.
Yeah, those are really annoying.
Unnumbered, then.
The unnumbered is closer to the end. In fact, this paper, the name of this file, which Joe got to see, is called incremental label tree or whatever. There's a DAG mentioned in the numbered version. Like the algorithm changed radically from when we started this paper to when it ended. It's like we call it the balance tree at one point, and the paper has nothing to do with balance trees by the time it's done. But
figured it out using the second sentence of the abstract.
The second thing.
There's a connecting sentence in there that makes it more obvious what you're trying to do, and that's why I called that one the final one.
Okay, well, the second sentence is both of them is actually, I think, exactly the same, but maybe it's the third. But anyhow,
yeah,
so
connecting sentence in there.
right. So there's connections, but also the number one starts with in recent years, with the advent of rich. So there's lots of words missing, whatever. So this is like raw, very raw stuff. So you can see there's more typos, whatever. But so like the phrase in recent years, this is classic stuff that when you're thinking, okay, so in recent years people have done this. Does that add anything to the paper? Length, yes. It adds gratuitous length. That's not good. So part of your job when you're editing is to start removing that stuff. And so there's a lot of that stuff to deal with. But in terms of the actual connections in the science, right? So in the numbered one, they talk about so during prediction time, a trained system has to deal with a large number of unseen categories. So part of the difference between these two is trying to motivate why is this problem important. So one started with like in recent years people are doing this. That's one way of trying to make it sound like it's relevant. In the second one, we talk about how advances have led to people actually using systems, trying to make that stronger. So the changes between these two versions seem subtle, but they actually, when you read them, often have a more impact. Well, yes, it'll make a difference because grammatarians care that open world is not one word, it's open and world. When we were writing the first version, right, I made up a word and connected them, right? I just taught it as one word. So this is a stylistic thing, but we weren't sure what we were going to call it in the beginning. Open world is what we settled on. So I also find it easier when I'm writing to use made-up words. Then I can then go in and replace. Because if I said open and world, it would be very hard to replace them because I might not always have used them. They might have split lines, all kinds of stuff, right? Where if I make it open world and we wanted to call it label tree, which is what we called it in the beginning, then I actually can replace them. In fact, in LaTeX, I often have a macro for the name of whatever it is, so I can change it easily and I will use it consistently. So I don't have to worry about having, as I change the names, I don't have to worry about breaking them up, but that's a little more structural thing. So now if you look at the way, and you can't quite see them because the references, you don't have the reference section, but the way we're using references in both of these is not the literature review. There actually is an entire section of this paper on the background, okay? But nowhere in the beginning of the intro are we actually, we're referring to what other people have done as a way of trying to say, look, other people have already done work that has dynamic data sets. Well, but we need to have that dynamic data into our machine learning. So we're trying to connect those two. Given the time, we'll go on and come back to discuss this sort of after we get through everything else. So in the beginning of this section, we're trying to set up the sort of problems and conflicts, risks and dangers that you always want in a story. Any good story has them, and it drives all story. It doesn't mean the stories are about failure. It doesn't mean that there's physical risks, right? The challenges are the success along the way. So in the first two sentences here, we're trying to set up that challenge. We have a world where things come into the world that we didn't know about beforehand, right? That's what we're trying to set up. Once people get this is, by the way, a concept we've been working on for years, and so we've refined how to tell this story. Once we got them hooked that this is a problem that's not being solved, the rest of it becomes pretty easy. So in terms of the kinds of things, it can be any of the risks that we talk about. It can be emotional, mental, social, professional, physical. It doesn't really matter what's going on, right? As long as you can make the people feel this would be bad. If they can imagine their system failing because of this, that's a danger. Once they get that danger, now they want you to solve it for them. Okay? And some other kinds of things we get would be accuracy, speed, cost. These are also dangers. It costs too much, it's too slow. All of those are dangers you can sort of talk about. Okay? So those are things that you're trying to put in the beginning. So I'm now sort of remember in Oscar we had opening, opening, setting the scene. The challenge is, right, the C in Oscar. So then we have action. And I'm not going to go too much into action. Action is all of the core of your paper. The experimental section, where we're going to talk about experimental design in a couple of weeks. So, but the last one is resolution. Okay, resolution to me is very important. We're talking about the difference between conclusions and discussions. Okay, lots of papers will talk about. They have a section called discussion. Some will call it the conclusion. Some will say conclusion of future work. We'll come back to that in a second. But in Oscar, you really want a conclusion, not a discussion. And a good way of thinking of that is to run Oscar in reverse. So you have your resolution. The problem is solved because we did this, which extended the work of so-and-so, which brings us back to solving big problems in the real world. You want your resolution to go all the way back to the problem you started with. It's not enough to say, we built our system and it's 20% faster. That may be true, but that doesn't relate back to why you built the system and convince the reader that this is an important thing. Okay? So your conclusion section needs to draw that conclusion. And often, and this is something I struggle with, I'm still getting better at this, by the way. The fact I've been doing this for a long time doesn't mean I'm good, I'm just better. What about talking about future work? Okay, so lots of people will have a section that ends with conclusions of future work. And future work is good. You don't want to make it sound like you've solved all the problems because people won't trust you. You've lost credibility if you do that. On the other hand, you really don't want to end your paper with, we did all this great stuff, and here's the next 4 things I would do. Why don't you want to end your paper that way? No, that's you want to actually mention those 4 things, but you don't want to end with them. You want to end with your paper as a real contribution, not like, yeah, I did this, but I really should have done these other things. Okay, I've gotten a review back that said this paper would have been good if they'd actually done what was in the future work. Okay, you've told the readers too much, and you put it at the end of the paper. They're going to say, well, why didn't you do that? Right? That's better than the other stuff you did. Okay, so if you're going to talk about future work, put the limitations, which really, future work is often limitations. We didn't study this. We didn't study that. Don't put it in your conclusions. Put it in the body of your method experiments. Okay, and there's definitely no need to summarize it again because it's not what you did. It's not a conclusion. So in your experiments, like, yes, it would be good to do this on bigger data sets. Put that in the data set section, the experiment section. If you really feel you have to because it doesn't fit in the data set section, use what we call the bad news sandwich. The bad news sandwich is the bad stuff is always in the middle. You lead with something good, you put a little bad in the middle, and then you end with something good so that people don't notice what they're getting. Okay? So you do that. So your conclusion might start with something really positive, and they say, yeah, there's some limitations to the work, but here's what we did that's really so significant. Here's our real contributions to science, but we're the first person to have solved this problem, and this already is directly useful, and whatever, and end with that. So if you do that, you really do it as a yes, but. But yes. But this is a problem. Yes, we did all of this. You don't really want to do it as yes, but. Yes, we did all this, but who cares? Because that's the way it reads. Okay, so make sure you end with on the sort of positive, strong side of that.
So you want the yes sandwich, not the but sandwich.
Yes.
And that pun was intended.
But I wasn't going to repeat it. So a couple of things in terms of writing that are sort of unavoidable sins, common avoidable sins. They're just worth mentioning. So lots of people, when they write, have this sort of motherhood or grandmotherhood, because it's even worse than motherhood openings, which is like, this is an important field. That's actually like in recent years, but it's even worse. Many people start their papers trying to make the problem solved important by saying how important the problem is. Don't tell me that the problem is important. Tell me how solving it is. Give me facts and figures. So be careful with how you open that. And there's actually, by the way, there's a bunch of papers on this that I'll put links in. I thought I had the links in here, so I still didn't say the right version. Another very common thing, which is okay in your thesis, but not okay in a paper, is a table of contents in paragraph form. If I have a 6-page paper, I don't need a section that says, in section 1, we will describe a related work. In section 2, we will do experiments. In section 3, we will give you conclusions for future work. Guess what? They already expected that. Don't use a paragraph to do that. Okay? Save the paragraph to say something important and meaningful. Don't undercut yourself by using textbook level material. If in the middle of your paper you're showing an equation that I can find in a standard textbook, you better be following that up real quick with some significant extension, or just like the textbook, because the reviewers will think this person doesn't even know what's important. This is textbook material. Okay? On the other hand, right, you don't want to gloss over things that are actually new and important. So you're probably not the right judge of that. Ask your advisor, ask some other student. But students often will think textbooks they haven't seen are still new, right? Even if it was done by Gaussen a couple hundred years ago. So conclusions that don't conclude. A summary is not a conclusion. This is probably the biggest problem I do see in sections, that it's not just the future work. Summarizing what you said in the paper, and this comes back to the adage that sometimes writers, teachings will have told you, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. That's sort of true, but in the conclusion, don't tell me what you told me. Tell me the impact of what you told me. That's what a conclusion is really about. With this, we now can conclude this. This is a contribution to science. In the intro, you might also have those literally tell them what that conclusion is. And another problem that's easily avoidable but problematic because people are writing at the last minute is when the opening and the conclusion have a mismatch. I talked about a very general problem, privacy overall, and when I'm done, I've got a technology solution that allows me to protect my database. I miss connecting that back up, which then leaves readers unsatisfied and really isn't the real conclusion. And I think I have a couple of other things in terms of differences from what your writing teachers told you. You want to repeat your major ideas in several places, and unlike what you get taught in writing, you don't want to vary how you present it. So if you're going to talk about a launch vehicle or a rocket, If you call it a launch vehicle, call it a launch vehicle every time. Don't refer to it as a rocket because I'm not trying to figure out what's different. In fact, to me, that they might be two different parts. Okay, if you're talking about an operating system and a file system, call them that. Maybe name them if you want to, if yours is special, but don't go for variety. Okay, now it may seem like it's very repetitive to you, right? You have read this introduction section, I don't know, 40 times probably I read this section. So if I see the same words in a couple places, it seems extremely repetitive. The reader will generally be reading it once, if at all. So they're not going to necessarily see that repetitiveness as a big problem. Okay, so be very careful of that. Now, if you used it 20 times, go ahead and if you've used it less than 20 times, it's really not that repetitive. If you've used it more than 20 times, find a way to not refer to it again because you've probably overbeaten that particular topic up. Okay. Related to that is the use of acronyms. Standard acronyms, despite what they tell you in lots of places, should not be expanded. Okay. If you're writing a paper about, computer science, would you ever expand ASCII? Right? It's an acronym, but please don't expand ASCII or a lot of other acronyms that are so standard in computer science. So if they're an undergraduate textbook and you're writing to people in your field, you don't need to expand those acronyms. You'll get feedback from reviewers who will say you have to expand this. Don't. Your reviewers know what that word is. Now, on the other hand, if you're using ASCII to mean something completely different than the character we use to represent computers, then do expand it and actually probably change it. So understanding what your acronyms are now. If you're going to use something 20 times, especially if it's a longer phrase, you can invent an acronym. Okay? If you're inventing an acronym to make it pronounceable, it's the name of your system, you can go with one or two. But otherwise, avoid inventing new ones that make it hard for your reader. You may think this makes it easier for your reader, and it doesn't. And this is a big problem I have because I love to invent acronyms because I can remember 3 letters, 5 letters is hard, 10 is impossible. So, TLAs are good for me. But it's bad form, so don't do too much of it. But you also want to be very careful to avoid instant repetition and tautologies, or whatever the opposite of a tautology is. Things like basic, fundamental, right? Those two words can't be combined. Final ending, true facts, mutual cooperation, right? Those words are redundant, so you want to remove those. And don't repeat the same word in 2 sentences in a row, right? So that is overly repetitive, right? If my eye can see both words on the screen at once, it's a problem in terms of my phobia, in terms of where I'm going. And then you want to rewrite it. But you don't rewrite it to replace it with a new word. Restructure it so you don't need to have those two put together. Okay, so to end with sort of our writing startup plan. First is to manage your time and plan your time. Okay, this is a key element about being effective at writing. Lots of students who fail to write good papers fail to start to write their papers until it's too late, almost guaranteeing failure. This paper, Avi and I started more than a month before it was due. Okay, and that's not starting it when we started writing with the experiments. That's when we started writing the final version in LaTeX and put it into Git and moving on the paper, right? A month is a reasonable time to take your final version and turn it into a real paper. Not that it's a month of solid work. You actually want to do this where you write it and you give it a day or two off. And then when you come back, it'll be different to you and you'll read it differently. And I also recommend you start off in the beginning. Don't think about writing. Think about this as communication. What is the story? And if you have to, say the entire thing and then translate it into text. That's fine. I do that regularly now where I speak into my phone and I have it converted to text. My biggest problem is that it'll make typos for me that I can't see because the word's close enough to me that it's there, but it's okay. And then in terms of generating ideas, we didn't actually go through this today, but there are some ideas about sort of how to put this together. So use of outlines, which Lisa already mentioned, and that can be good if it works for you. That's not really, in my view, generating ideas. That's organizing ideas. An outline doesn't generate ideas. That's just how you put them in order. So it's okay. You can sort of do that. To actually generate ideas, I would recommend something like questioning, question listening, question answering, where you make up a bunch of questions about your problem, about your domain, and then use that to generate ideas. How do I make sure I've answered that question? It's not how do I answer the question. It's how do I put something in my paper to make sure I answer that question in the beginning, not what the answer is, because that's actual writing. This is more idea generation. If you can come up with ideas, then you can go back to your outlining and figure out how to connect them. Okay? If you really want to do outlining for a paper, you want to talk about how you're going to rearrange some of those elements, you might think about posted cards or notes so that they're actually easier to reorder them. Okay? The exercise I had you do which is free writing, where you close your eyes and just write your ideas and then put them together. Free talking, both of those are two ways of getting good things. People talk about using brainstorming or brainstorming outlining, which is another way. So in brainstorming, you sort of sit around and talk about ideas. This is what many of us think of as conversations. That's good, but in fact, I would recommend you try and do something that adds a little bit of constraint. Just talking doesn't have enough constraints, so your ideas go slow and they don't draw any really creative ideas out. So add a constraint where you're only allowed to use action verbs. This is a really good way of making sure you're describing your stuff in an action-oriented style. And then another one is to try and do it with words that rhyme. I have yet to find a graduate student that wants to do this. I haven't actually asked too many because it was turned down way too often, but it's actually how I do my own brainstorming. I like the rhyme. Rhyming helps me remember stuff, and so I connect stuff. But rhyming puts a constraint where I want to find something to connect it to. Or do it where you have to start with a particular letter, so you're going for literally alliteration. You'll be surprised. It seems unnatural, but this will help you find new ways of describing what you're doing that will tap into other parts of what you would otherwise not notice in your thought process. So the 5 key steps: start early, edit often, edit some more, get some feedback, edit even more. Okay, editing is what this process is actually about, not writing. And the more you edit, the finer and finer you'll be able to refine the paper. And that's why I also recommended tools that allow you to have many, many versions, because that's when you can edit them together. And sometimes what you're going to want to do is go back and grab this last section, because now that I've re-edited the first section, this last section actually from before was better. So you're going to want to take those pieces back and forth together. So class go to 4:20 or 4:30? 20? Okay, then I will stop. So you got the piece of paper. If you want, Jonathan will process stuff. I forget about this. So next week we will have our first faculty